Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the bishop d2 sideline in the Winawer variation of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the Winawer occurs when white plays knight to c3 and black plays bishop to b4. So normally, the main line for white is to now play pawn to e5, but there are a number of side lines that black needs to know about. So one of them is bishop to d2. Now, at first glance, this move looks very reasonable. It seems very intuitive. Basically, black was pinning white's knight to the king, and black was also potentially threatening to trade the bishop and mess up white's pawn structure. However, the move bishop d2 has some serious drawbacks and actually allows black to equalize very easily. So the best move for black in this position is to just play d takes e4. White can't actually really take this pawn back right away because black can just take on d4. And note that the bishop is defended. So instead, another try that white could go for is knight to e2, just to defend this pawn. But black can just play knight to f6, maybe getting ready to take over here. White would have to take back with the bishop because otherwise this pawn would be unprotected. So as a result, white would now take here. I would take here. White has to take back with the knight because otherwise this knight would hang. And black could just castle here and have a very pleasant position, whereas white's knights are kind of in the way of white's other pieces, and white has not yet castled. Like, objectively, the engine gives black a very slight edge here. But, this does not seem like a challenging position for black to deal with. Like, there is still the issue of the French bishop, but black is fine here. As a result, back in this position, we looked at knight takes e4 and knight ge2. There's only really one move that has ever really been played at top level. Only really one good move for white, and that is queen to g4. And here in this position, there are two main moves for black. And it's actually important to know about both of them because each one of these two moves is useful for a different situation depending on your opponent and depending on, whether you are happy to just walk away with an early draw from the opening. So, objectively, the best move for black is knight to f6, but this does lead to a repetition. After knight to f6, best move for white is to regain the pawn with queen takes g7, rook to g8, queen to h6. Black can now take the pawn on d4. White can now castle, and basically the way that the repetition works is black just plays bishop to f8, rook to g6 is also possible. If the queen goes to f4, then you just play bishop to d6. It's important to notice that the queen was eyeing this pawn on c7. If the queen goes here, you just bring the rook up like this. If the queen goes here, you just bring your rook back to g6 and keep harassing the queen. There's actually a very important trap to know about here that a number of grandmasters have actually fallen for. And that is, if black plays bishop to f8, if you want, you can pause the video and try to find the move for white. It's actually kind of hilarious that this is in the Masters database. Like, there have been a number of titled players who have messed up here. I will reveal the moves in 3, 2, 1. So basically, whites can actually just win a bishop by playing queen takes f8 check. After king takes f8, bishop to h6 check, king to e7 or some other move, rook takes queen. And if we count the minor pieces, we see that white has 4 of them, whereas black only has 3. And the number of rooks is, of course, the same for each side. Black is just up a bishop. Sorry, white is just up a bishop, and black does not have any good compensation for it. In fact, there are plenty of other pluses that white has here as well, such as a safer king and a better pawn structure. If we turn on the engine's just like, this is horrible. If we go back to the position with the trap, like, yeah, this is why it's +7 here, but not here. So it's important to remember, of course, that when the queen goes here, you do not want to fall for this. You want to just play rook to g6, and then you will have a draw. Like, if white tries deviating, like with queen to h3, then you take the pawn over here. And if white goes queen to e3, then you actually are fine with trading queens. Means because black is actually just up a pawn here, if I'm able to count correctly. Yeah, black has 4 pawns here versus 3. 3 versus 3, black is up a pawn, so black is fine with a queen trade and getting closer to an endgame. But you might not necessarily want a draw. So that is how you would get a draw after knight to f6. And, you know, you might be interested in playing that if you're in a situation where your opponent is like 400 points, like 400 rating points above you, where you basically feel that winning is hopeless and you're happy to walk away with a draw. It's good to know about that repetition. Or if you're in a situation where it's like the last round of a tournament and basically getting a draw will guarantee you first place, whereas getting a loss might have you tie for first place or something. And so it's still good to know about, you know, this repetition, even though queen takes d4 is a much more fun move. So if you don't want an early draw, then queen takes d4 is still perfectly playable. It only gives white a tiny edge, but white kind of has an edge by default just from, you know, having the first move in the game. And basically, the best move here, according to the engine, has very rarely ever been played. Or the best sequence of moves, I should say. Like, there's quite a bit of unexplored territory here. The best move for white is knight to f3, just kind of kicking the queen away. This queen pins the pawn, so pawn takes f3 is not possible. Best move for black is to now just retreat the queen back to f6. White can now regain the pawn like so. And black can just drop back, defend their bishop, which is under attack by the queen, and also prepare to play knight to f6. But the problem with this position is that this has never been played by titled players. Like, I even looked in ChessBase, and all I found was games by amateurs. Like, in fact, I think there was only one game with good moves that where basically one player was unrated and the other player was 1700. So sadly, we can't really look much at this position, even though we can probably see that black is doing okay here. And, you know, it's dynamically equal, I would say, if we turn on the engine. Gives white a very tiny advantage, but only if white finds, you know, some very specific moves. What is more common in this position is instead of going for the knight f3 idea, white might instead go for Castle's queenside. And basically, this is much more common. And there are a number of moves that black can play here. But before continuing, I thought that I should just introduce the players. So with the white pieces, we have international master Ivan Hausner, who is an IM from the Czech Republic. Although, unfortunately, that's all the information that I could find about him. But although that does kind of make sense, since this game is actually fairly old. The reason why I had to choose an old game is because grandmasters these days know about the draw, they know about that repetition, and, you know, generally white is not playing for a draw, white is playing for a win. Whereas black is often very happy to walk away with a draw at the grandmaster level. Anyway, okay, so I unfortunately could not find much information about white, right, besides their name, their title, and their federation. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Wolfgang Uhlmann, who is a Grandmaster from Germany, or back in the day, what was known as East Germany. And he was one of the most successful players from East Germany of all time. Like, he won the East Germany Chess Championship 11 times, and he also made it to the Candidates Tournament in 1971, which I believe was the tournament that Bobby Fischer won in order to face Forrest Spassky. And most importantly for us, Grandmaster Uhlmann, like the reason why I chose this game, Grandmaster Uhlmann is one of the old masters of the French, in particular the Winawer Variation. In fact, there is a very nice game that he played against Bobby Fischer in 1960 where he won with the Winawer. The reason why that game is not in this series is because the theory of that game is not quite up to date, which is very understandable because they didn't have engines back then. Anyway, this particular game was played in 1981 in a tournament in Germany, in the Halle Buna region of Germany, which I unfortunately don't know much about. And yeah, that's all I know. More information, or at the very least what information I have, can be found in the video description. Now back to the game. So white has now castled queenside, putting their rook on the same file as this queen, eyeing it, getting ready to do nasty stuff. And black has a number of options here. The engine prefers playing pawn to f5, but that does look a little bit scary just because it does open up this diagonal, and it also makes the development of this bishop a little bit more awkward. But at the same time, pawn to f5 does help defend this extra pawn that black has. So, you know, there are arguments for and against it. Black instead played a much more intuitive, much safer move, pawn to h5, just harassing this queen and taking some space. We have queen to e2. Ooh, best move according to the engine. The queen doesn't have a whole lot of squares it can go to without being harassed. Part of the reason why black wants to kick this queen away is just so that, you know, black doesn't have to always be defending that pawn over there. Black now played bishop to d7. The engine doesn't like this move, but I think this move is just fine. Like, black, in my opinion, has kind of already succeeded in getting what they want from the opening, which is just to get a dynamically equal position. White plays pawn to f3, trying to deal with this annoying pawn here. And black now plays knight to c6. Next, white now wins this pawn. If black had taken the pawn, then white would develop with tempo. White would be pretty happy to have that, since white's got fairly active pieces that are getting ready to spring into action. So we have f takes e4, queen to b6, because black is getting kind of scared of this bishop moving away and doing some stuff. We have pawn to a3. Black now plays bishop to e7. The engine doesn't like this. The engine considers this to be inaccurate. The engine wants black to trade for the knight over there, but I think bishop to e7 is just fine. I don't have any issue with it. Just because the engine doesn't like a move, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Sometimes a move might, be best according to the engine, but might lead to a position that's more drawish, while the position that isn't as good in the engine's eyes does kind of keep more chances on the board. In this case, when you are playing for a win, sometimes you generally just want to avoid making unnecessary trades. Like, black probably evaluated that bishop takes c3. It kind of actually just improves white's pieces. Like, white could take back with their bishop maybe. Maybe their rook gets happy, Why do I want to trade my bishop for that knight? So I don't hate bishop e7. I don't hate bishop d7. I think those moves are just fine. We have knight to f6, just developing. Queen to e1, getting ready to maybe get this queen out over here or over here. Also freeing up this bishop, getting him out. Black's like, no, you cannot put either piece on b5. Like, that's a common thing that often does happen in the French. Very often, white will be eyeing this square. White kind of does a similar thing with this square over here, not letting the knight jump here. So black now plays queen to a7, maybe getting ready for some b5 ideas, or maybe being afraid of knight a4 stuff, things of that nature. We have queen to g3, which on the surface looks like a decent move. but in actuality isn't so great. Like, in this case, I do agree with the engine. Queen g3 is not a great move, since black just castles, defending this pawn. And if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out why queen takes g7 is no good. Why this pawn is not really hanging. I will reveal the reason in 3, 2, 1. So the reason why this is no good is because black will actually just trap white's queen. With rook dg8, it's important to use this rook because of the follow-up move. It's also important that we take away the queen's retreat. So after queen takes f7, I can play rook h7, and everything is defended, and the queen has nowhere to go. The queen has to give herself up for one of black's rooks, and that's no good. So thankfully, that is not what happened in the game. Instead, we have, oops, sorry about that. We have the move bishop to d3, just developing another piece. Black plays h4, just trying to take some space, get active. It actually does seem like white can take this pawn, but white decided to delay that by one move. White plays queen to e1, black plays knight to h5, eyeing this square, and now white pretty much has to kind of take the pawn right now, because the knight getting to that square is no good. That's just a very strong square for the knight. So white takes. Black's like, okay, I'll put something else to support that square. Maybe play bishop here and take this knight. So white decides to play bishop to e3. And now there's a bit of a positional idea. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out what it was that black now did. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So this isn't something that wins material, but basically black just played queen takes e3 with check. White takes back. Black plays bishop to f4, winning back the queen via a pin. And basically, the reason why this is a bit of a positional idea is because if we look here, black's queen is kind of awkward. If black just moves their queen or something, the queen is kind of out of the game and has difficulty getting into the game. Has difficulty getting, like, doing anything. Whereas white's queen can still potentially do stuff. White's queen is much better than black's queen in this position. So that is probably why black did all this. So bishop to f4, we have queen takes f4, knight takes f4. Black may have kind of given back the pawn that they got out of the opening, but black does have some nice active pieces. Like, the only pieces that are really all that bad are this bishop and maybe this knight. Like, this rook is pretty happy. He's got a nice file. And this knight is very, very happy, whereas this knight is a little bit silly. So we have knight to f3. It looks like black can take this pawn, but rook coming here and taking that doesn't seem like such a great idea. So instead, black plays pawn to f6. Somewhere in the future, Ben Feingold is screaming in agony. He was probably screaming in agony back then as well, since I think he was alive at the time that this game was played. So we have rook d2, bishop to e8, trying to get the bishop in maybe here or maybe also here. And also another idea behind f6 was just to support pawn to e5, right, forming a nice little strong pawn chain and taking control of the center, stuff like that, supporting the knight on f4. Rook to f1, pawn to e5, supporting this knight. We have knight d5, knight takes, pawn takes, and here in this position, black now took this pawn. Just kidding. If black did that, there would be bishop here and then rook takes, or bishop there, rook back, bishop takes rook, stuff like that. So black instead plays knight to e7, hitting this pawn a different way. We have c4, defending the pawn, c6, the pawn can't really come forward. The bishop also doesn't have the square because the knight will take. So dc6, bishop takes c6, improving the bishop this way, since the bishop could no longer really come over here, and it doesn't really want to go there because that kind of blocks this rook in. Also, there isn't really a whole lot on this diagonal, whereas there's a pawn on this diagonal, there's stuff there. Bishop c2, king to c7, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook d1, rook h8, rook f1, b5, cb5, bishop takes b5, rook f2, knight d5. Black's just trying to get their pieces mobilized and striking at white's position, whereas white's pieces are a little bit awkward. Notice that almost all of black's stuff is on dark squares, so this bishop is quite a bit weaker. We have pawn to h4, knight to f4. We have pawn to g3, which is a bit of a silly move, although we're going to see why. Like, at first glance, it seems fine, but basically black is able to win this pawn. Knight e2 check, there, knight takes here. Basically, after rook g2, knight h5 defends this, and it's a bit unclear how to actually deal with this knight, how to get it away. Like, I suppose an interesting sample line just to look at is what if white tried this, but that would just walk into that. But I would turn on the engine just to be very, very sure. But anyway, that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we have king to e3, rook to d8, bishop to e4, rook to d1. And white is kind of playing without a plan at the moment, since white's next move is bishop to c2, whereas black is kind of advancing. Black is kind of doing something with their pieces. Black has a very strong e-pawn, very strong protected pass pawn that's also taking some space in the center, whereas white, has difficulty putting their pieces in the center because of black's pawns. So we have bishop to e4, rook to c1, bishop to d5, rook to d1, bishop to f7. Some of these moves are probably just to gain time, although we did just hit the time control a couple of moves ago. We are now on move 43. So bishop to f7 turns out to be a little bit inaccurate due to this cool idea with rook d3 check. It should be noted that if white now plays king to e5, or king to e4, I should say, sorry about that. Knight to f4 is pretty annoying because it defends the rook. It hits this rook, and it basically prepares this move, which might win this knight. Stuff like that. A very strong square for this knight to go to. So as a result, after rook d3 check, the king can't really advance. The king has to go back. We still have knight to f4. Still a great square for the knight. Pawn on g7 is lost. But we now have an interesting situation where the rook is pinning the bishop to this rook. It's hard for white to, untangle their pieces. We have pawn to b3, bishop to c6. Black is probably getting ready to do something like maybe bishop to here, since basically if rook goes here, for example, like I should probably show that. Like if rook here, then actually bishop here is fine too. So like bishop here first is fine, but bishop here also works. And this bishop will have to basically trade. Otherwise, basically if the bishop goes to g6 or g8, it gets taken. And if it takes this guy, then the rook takes over here. So it's important just to take note of that. So that's why in this position, instead of doing something like rook h7, white played pawn to h5, seemingly giving up this pawn for no reason, but that is the reason. So knight takes h5, rook to h7, knight goes back to f4. Now there is time for bishop to g8. Black trades the rooks. We have knight to h3 check, king to g3, and black sees that they are able to simplify into a winning endgame. Like black is up, let's see, one pawn, but these pawns are awesome, whereas these pawns, they're not so great. Like these are connected passers, whereas there's no pass pawn over here. And also white's king is kind of far away from them. We have king to d6, king to g3, bishop to b7, bishop to f5, king to d5, pawn to b4, king to c4, bishop e6 check, king to d3, just getting ready to send this guy up the board. This pawn is going to be faster than these pawns, and white has to, white would have to defend with their king, stuff like that. But anyway, we instead have pawn to a4, pawn to e4. Here come the pawns. King to f4, trying to be active. Pawn to e3, bishop to f5 check, king to d2, bishop to g4, bishop to c8. And it was in this position that white now resigned. Like, black could have probably gone pawn to e2 first, but part of the idea of bishop to c8 is probably just to cover this square. I think it turns out to not really be that necessary to do this, but if it makes your opponent resign, that's pretty cool. Like, one thing that black does have to be mindful of is that if this bishop gives itself up for this pawn, and white is able to win this pawn as well, then white can actually just let their pawns die. White can just let these pawns die and focus on getting their king to the corner over here. Because basically, black's bishop is the wrong color for this rook pawn. And like, black has to make sure, like, if these pawns both vanish, that black's able to win these pawns and also stop white's king from getting to these two squares. So, let's see. I suppose I could show sort of a sample continuation, since endgames are also quite important. So, for example, let's just turn on the engine, make sure I don't make any silly moves. Goes bishop to here, there, bishop takes here, king takes here. Here, we could have pawn to b5, pawn to a5, since black doesn't really want to trade pawns. Black wants to keep more pawns on the board if possible, since it's harder to promote a pawn when you have less pawns. Pawn to b6. Just move the king is fine. Pawn to b7, bishop takes, king goes here, and then probably, I think there are quite a few moves here that win for black, but bishop to c6 is fairly intuitive. Then after king takes here, bishop here, king up here, probably something like just king here, just stop this king from getting to this corner. Like rook pawn endgames are not always drawn, especially if you're able to stop the king from getting there. And then after, say, king here, just move this bishop somewhere, or maybe to here, for example, and then just move the pawn up the board, and that would be enough to win. Like, there's nothing that white can really do here. Like, I thought I should show that, since endgames are pretty important, and I have been working on mine. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That's all for now. Until next time.